The night was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind of silence that pressed into the heart, heavy, unspoken, and impossible to escape. In a grand house filled with marble, glass, and chandeliers, there lived a people who shared the same roof, the same last name, and the same vows but not the same world. For 2 years, their marriage had been marked by distance, not closeness, by polite conversations, not laughter, by routine, not warmth. He was Daniel Hart, a man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, a CEO whose empire stretched far beyond the city lights. To the world, he was power and perfection. Every gesture was precise, every word measured, every move calculated. Yet when he returned home, his strength became silence. The mansion that echoed with his authority at work turned into a place where his footsteps were the only sound. She was Elena, a woman with a soul made for colors and stories, not contracts and walls. She filled her days with quiet hobbies: painting, reading, the delicate art of pressing flowers, anything that reminded her of beauty in a place that often felt hollow. To those who saw them together at galas or dinners, they looked like the perfect couple, graceful, untouchable, a portrait of elegance. But behind the polished smiles, they lived in different rooms, slept in separate beds, and carried unspoken words like invisible chains. And yet, there were moments, fleeting, fragile, when Daniel's eyes lingered on Elena longer than necessary. A pause in the middle of pouring his wine, a stillness when she walked past him, a look that wasn't supposed to be there, but was. She noticed. She always noticed. What she didn't know was that he noticed too. And in that silence, a storm was waiting. Days slipped into weeks, and weeks folded into months, each one looking much like the last. Their life together was carefully arranged, like a stage set where every detail had its place. Yet the performance never began. Daniel immersed himself in work, his calendar overflowing with meetings, contracts, and flights. Success was his shield, and the more he achieved, the less he had to face the truth of his own heart. At home, the distance between him and Elena was not measured in walls or rooms, but in the silence that grew deeper each evening at dinner. Elena, though quiet by nature, carried within her a longing she tried to silence with books and brushes. She painted skies brighter than her reality, pages of her journal filled with questions she would never dare ask aloud. Why had fate brought her into a marriage where her voice felt unheard, her presence unseen? She was not angry. She was patient, almost painfully so. She believed there was more to Daniel than his armor of discipline and control. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze would soften, not much, just enough to reveal the man he might have been before the weight of power shaped him. What she didn't know was that Daniel felt that weight even at home. He told himself he was protecting her by keeping distance, as if closeness might undo the order he had built his life upon. But at night, in those rare moments of stillness, he found his thoughts drifting back to her, the sound of her laugh in the early days, the grace in her silence now. Neither of them spoke it, but the truth was there, beneath the cold rituals and rehearsed smiles. Something fragile still lived, and the smallest spark, if it ever caught fire, could change everything. One evening, the air outside carried the faint scent of rain, and Elena stood by the tall window of her room, watching droplets slide down the glass. The world beyond looked blurred, but inside her heart the truth was sharp. 2 years had passed, and she had never truly felt like a wife. She whispered a prayer to the silence, not asking for wealth or grandeur, only for a sign that her marriage wasn't a hollow shell. Her hands trembled as she held her teacup, not from the cold, but from the weight of waiting. Daniel returned home later than usual that night, his tie loosened, his expression unreadable. He moved through the house as he always did, controlled, precise. Yet when he reached the dining hall, he paused. Elena was there, seated quietly, her book unopened on the table. Something about the stillness in her eyes unsettled him. For the first time, he felt as if she was no longer waiting for him, but letting go of him. That thought struck deeper than any business failure ever could. He sat across from her, and for the first time in months, the silence felt unbearable. He wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Instead, his eyes lingered on the small details: the way her hair caught the soft light, the way her hands folded gently on her lap, It was then he realized how much of her he had overlooked, how much of her strength and beauty had gone unnoticed while he buried himself in walls of control. Elena lifted her gaze and, for a heartbeat, their eyes met. It was not anger she carried, not even sadness. It was a quiet strength, a kind of courage that came from enduring loneliness without bitterness. That look stirred something long dormant inside him. For the first time in 2 years, Daniel wondered not how to protect his empire, but how to protect the woman sitting in front of him. And that night, as the rain fell harder, something invisible began to shift between them. The following days unfolded differently, though nothing obvious had changed. The routine remained: the dinners, the distant nods, the quiet walks through the hallways, but underneath it all was a new tension. Daniel found himself distracted at work, his thoughts drifting back to the quiet courage in Elena's eyes. He was a man who had built companies, conquered markets, and held his ground against rivals. Yet he realized he had been losing the one battle that truly mattered: the battle for his own home. Elena noticed the subtle shift as well. At dinner, his gaze lingered longer. His silence felt less like distance and more like hesitation. One evening, she found herself setting an extra spoon of soup in his bowl without thinking. And to her surprise, he actually thanked her, not with the usual clipped formality, but with a softness that unsettled her heart. It wasn't much, but to a woman starved of connection, it was enough to plant the smallest seed of hope. Late one night, unable to sleep, Daniel wandered into the library where Elena often spent her evenings. He saw her asleep in the chair, a book resting loosely in her hands, her head tilted slightly to the side. The lamplight wrapped her in a glow that made her look almost untouchable. For a long time, he simply stood there, staring at the woman who had been beside him yet apart from him for 2 long years. In that moment, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: fear. Fear that if he didn't act soon, she would slip away from him. Not physically, but in spirit, leaving only a shell of what once could have been. He gently placed a blanket over her shoulders and turned to leave. But Elena stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Their gazes met again, and this time, neither of them looked away. No words passed between them, but in that silence lay a promise that the walls around them were beginning to crack. The morning sun filtered gently through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the quiet dining room. For the first time in years, Daniel arrived at the table before Elena. He sat there, waiting, his fingers tapping against the porcelain cup as though he were rehearsing a meeting with himself. When she entered, surprised to see him already seated, their eyes met, and instead of turning away as he usually did, he held her gaze. Something about that moment felt different, almost fragile, as if the slightest word could break it or bring it to life. He cleared his throat, searching for words that refused to come easily. He had spoken to shareholders, presidents, and partners without hesitation, yet now, sitting across from the woman who had shared his name for 2 years, he felt uncharacteristically unsure. "Elena," he said softly, her name carrying a weight he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. She looked at him, steady and calm, waiting. He wanted to explain everything: the fears, the reasons he had hidden behind work, the silence he had mistaken for protection, but the confession tangled in his chest. Instead, he said the simplest thing, words he hadn't spoken to her in their marriage: "You deserve more than this." For Elena, it was as if the air shifted. She had spent years convincing herself not to hope, teaching her heart to accept what little warmth came her way. But hearing him admit even that much opened a door she thought was forever locked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both gratitude and caution, like a person who has touched something too delicate to believe it's real. That day lingered in Daniel's mind long after he left for work. For the first time, he wasn't thinking of profits or projections, but of her, the patience in her silence, the quiet strength in her eyes. He knew then that reclaiming his wife wouldn't be about grand gestures or luxury. It would be about courage, about finally daring to step beyond the walls he had built around himself. And somewhere deep inside, Elena began to wonder if the story she thought was ending was, in fact, only just beginning. The evening came quietly, with a soft breeze stirring the curtains and carrying the scent of blooming roses from the garden. Elena stood on the balcony, her hands resting lightly on the railing, eyes lifted to the fading sky. She had grown used to this spot, her refuge of calm, yet tonight felt different. Behind her, footsteps approached, measured, steady, but slower than usual, as if each step carried thought. Daniel stopped a few paces away, watching her in silence. For 2 years he had passed her like a shadow, but tonight he knew he could not let the moment slip away. "Elena," he said, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it, almost uncertain. She turned, and in the twilight glow he looked less like the untouchable CEO and more like a man stripped of his defenses. For a long heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he took a breath, the kind a person takes before stepping into the unknown. "I've built empires, fought battles, and conquered fears that the world thought mattered. But the truth is, I've failed where it mattered most. I let silence take your place when it should have been me standing beside you." Her eyes widened, her heart stumbling against the weight of his words. She had imagined this moment countless times, yet never believed it would come. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling with years of unspoken longing. He stepped closer, his eyes steady on hers. 2 years I've kept my distance, telling myself it was safer, easier. But every day I saw you. Every day I wanted to reach for you. Tonight, I'm done letting fear decide for me. If you'll let me, I want to claim back not just the title of husband, but the place I should have always held in your heart." Tears gathered in her eyes, not of sadness but of release. The walls that had trapped them both finally crumbled, and for the first time in 2 years, Elena felt the warmth of his closeness not just in distance, but in spirit. The silence that once divided them was replaced by something stronger, something real. And as the stars appeared above, it was clear their story was not one of endings, but of beginnings, proof that even after years of distance, love could be found again, stronger than before.